An apparent attempt to overthrow the government of the Republic of Georgia entered its second day in what appears to be an attempted replay of the Maidan in Ukraine. RT's Nikki filed this report on Wednesday.
Thousands are taking to the streets in a second day of protest against a new foreign agent bill passed by Parliament. Several other cities have also hosted mass rallies. Many women have joined the demonstrations in a march against what they call total control. US and EU flags have been spotted in the crowds in front of Georgia's Parliament building in Tbilisi. Let's get the details now from our correspondent who's there for us, Don Quarter. Don, many thanks for joining us. Tell us what the situation on the ground is like at the moment, and does it look like things are heating up or cooling down?
Hi there, Nikki. Well, I'm in the center of the action here in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. Right behind me, the Parliament building, in front of which thousands of people have gathered to oppose this draft legislation that the Parliament passed that would essentially make it so that every organization that receives over 20% of their funding from foreign sources would have to register as foreign agencies. A lot of these protesters are calling this a Russian-style law. There's a lot of Ukrainian flags here and European Union flags, some implied anti-Russian sentiment, even though this, a very similar law also exists in the United States, actually. It was passed back in 1938 before any sort of foreign agency law was passed in Russia or, of course, draft legislation here. Now, today, the protests have been relatively peaceful, but the protesters' leadership have given the Parliament an ultimatum. They've said that the Parliament has 1 hour to release all of the protesters who have been arrested here and revoke its support for this draft legislation. Otherwise, the protesters will take, quote unquote, different measures. That's because, yesterday when these protests broke out, they were anything but peaceful. We saw protesters throwing Molotov cocktails, setting up barricades. They even tried to storm the Parliament building in an event that a lot of people have been likening to the events of the Euromaidan coup d'etat back in 2014 that happened in Ukraine. Now, the Georgian president right now is in the United States, and she released a video supporting the protesters and calling for the Parliament to revoke its support for this draft legislation, coming out in criticism of this draft legislation. So we've got some sort of rift right here, right now, between the Parliament and the president. It's not so clear whether it's going to heat up or cool down right now. The Parliament seems pretty firm in its position, and if it stays that way, it's very likely that we will see a continuation of what happened last night as well, where around 60 protesters were arrested and around 50 police officers were injured.
Nebojša Malić is a Serbian-American journalist, blogger, and translator. He spoke with RT's Nikki earlier in the day about what was motivating the organizers of the protests in Tbilisi, and also some background about the law that's the subject of the protests, including the one that exists in the United States and how it was treated on January 6th, 2021.
Judging by the number of Ukrainian flags seen at these riots and the fact that the Ukrainian state propaganda is really interested in what's going on, I'm inclined to believe that Kiev has a direct interest in overthrowing the current Georgian government and replacing it with one that would be more pro-Ukrainian oriented, because they've been attempting for the past year to basically bring in Georgia on their side and open a second front against Russia in the Caucasus. And the Georgian government, to their credit, has refused to do this. They're sort of turning a blind eye to Georgians who go to Ukraine to enlist in the Ukrainian military. There's like a Georgian Legion and all these other formations that are pretty notorious on the battlefield. But they're officially staying out of it because they don't want to fight a war with Russia. They saw what it looks like in 2008. They didn't like it. They're still having a territorial dispute. They would prefer to resolve it peacefully, and they don't want to be cannon fodder for outside actors, which is partly why they're doing this whole foreign agent law. And I'm guessing this also might be based on the suspicion that there are external forces, such as the State Department, trying to push them into basically taking part in this conflict on behalf of the U.S., as opposed to on behalf of some Georgian interests.
Well, we have the Georgian Prime Minister who's standing by the bill. The Georgian President has said that she will veto the bill if it reaches her desk. She's spoken out in support of the protests as well, as we know. What sort of power struggle are we now seeing in the country, and which side looks to have the most public support?
Well, that will depend. The president, I believe, based on the most recent reforms, the next president's position will be largely ceremonial. The current president was elected in a popular vote, and she was actually backed by the current ruling party, but they had a falling out about a year or two ago. And so now she's basically representing just herself. I believe she was elected in 2018, so her mandate might be coming to an end very soon. And you have a situation in which you have a popularly elected government. I believe the ruling party has close to an absolute majority in the parliament by itself. Given, out of 150 seats, they have 74, and there's 12 vacants. So they really have more than 50% just by themselves. Whereas the largest opposition party by itself has 12. So really, I mean, if you're judging by election results, the current government has the popular support. But if you're looking at the street protests, then it seems like the opposition can try to sort of force street democracy upon it. So now the final question is whether the government will actually bend the knee to this attempted color revolution and surrender to the demands of the street, or whether they will uphold the rule of law such as it is and resist foreign pressure.
Comparisons are already being made to what we're seeing right now in Tbilisi and, of course, what happened in Ukraine in the Maidan uprising. Crowds of people waving EU flags, American flags. To what extent can we draw parallels between the 2014 uprising in Ukraine and what's happening right now in Tbilisi?
Well, it's actually the bit better parallel is 2003, because the original Georgian Revolution, the Rose Revolution of 2003, was another color revolution inspired and run by the United States that brought the government of Mikhail Saakashvili into power. And the current government of Georgia basically emerged in 2012 as opposition to this. And this foreign agent law that they're trying to enact is essentially trying to limit the influence of the State Department and all NGOs in general, but Western ones in particular, because they've sort of been running the country for the past 20 years, regardless of who is actually in the government. I mean, I'm sort of sitting here being baffled as to how, tens of thousands of people would object to a law trying to enact some sort of transparency as to, where this foreign money is coming from into quasi-governmental agencies determining a country's policy. And yet here's Georgians basically being told by the opposition, which is led by Saakashvili's old party. I believe, is in jail for attempting to overthrow the government, that, this is a Russian law. Well, it's actually an American law. As you said, the FARA is actually harsher, and it involves criminal penalties for individuals. This is infinitely more lenient. And yet here they are denouncing this as a Russian law and saying this is against their European values. But European Union has harsher laws for people they regard to be foreign agents, and they've literally censored and banned and confiscated property of people that they consider to be interfering. The Americans themselves are enacting FARA against political opponents and dissidents. So, and then you have the U.S. Embassy saying, "Oh, this is an attack on democracy." Well, what gives? If it's an attack on democracy, why do you have your own law? Why do you enforce this law at home? It can't possibly be that this law is terrible when enacted in Georgia, but great when enacted in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, we've seen this extreme reaction from a huge number of people. Reports say that protesters have been throwing Molotov cocktails as well at the police. So it's clearly not a peaceful protest, is it? So why then would the country's president, as well as Western politicians and the media, be supporting the riots if they're not peaceful?
Well, when you speak about the president of Georgia, you have to bear in mind that she was born in France. She was the French ambassador to Georgia. And then in 2004, after Saakashvili came to power, he gave her Georgian citizenship and appointed her foreign minister. So, she's quite literally acting on behalf of the EU and the U.S. And she's currently in the U.S. for a state visit. Or maybe a private visit. I don't know. She spoke from New York, and she's saying, "Oh, I'm against this." Well, I'm sorry, lady, but if the vast majority of lawmakers in the parliament vote in favor of a law, how is that not democracy? I mean, either Georgia has a state in which there are rules and procedures, or, whatever the American embassy says goes. But in that case, don't call it a democracy. Call it a colony. Call it an oligarchy. Call it whatever. But it's definitely not a sovereign democracy then.
In January 2021, when protesters stormed Congress, Washington was very quick to condemn the protesters who did that. It was an insurrection. So why now are the same tactics being condoned by the West in Georgia?
Well, because it's never about tactics. The way this logic works in Western political establishment is that it doesn't matter what one does, only who does it to whom. So when, for example, American Republicans have a mass protest outside the Capitol and question the results of an election, that's clearly not acceptable and not allowed. And, terrorism, crime, greatest attack on our democracy since Pearl Harbor. But when Ukrainians set police officers on fire and insist on overthrowing their legitimately elected government, that's democracy, because they're doing it on behalf of the State Department and Victoria Nuland, who's giving them out cookies. When the Georgians set police officers on fire and show up with gas masks and helmets and, throw fireworks at police, that's democracy. But if that same police acts like the Capitol Police did on January 6th, then that's dictatorship. The U.S. itself has a much harsher law. And you've had the European Union cracking down on, any sort of foreign funding and basically labeling organizations Russian agents based on no due process whatsoever. And yet, obviously what's good for that particular goose is not good for the Georgian gander, because when the Georgian government says, okay, wait, maybe, all of these so-called, non-governmental organizations that are essentially entirely funded by George Soros or other, or the U.S. government or Norwegian government or the EU or whatever, through any sort of number of cutouts, maybe they should be accountable. Maybe they should be transparent. You can't just, create all of these proposals and initiatives backed by foreign money and then claim to be a Georgian Democrat. Well, that's clearly unacceptable to the West. So it really tells you everything about the values that these people claim to profess.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.